So picture this, it's 1947. India is newly independent. Now it has this massive task ahead. It's not just about building a nation from the inside, but also figuring out who are we going to be on the world stage, especially with the Cold War splitting the world in two. How does a brand new country born from a long, hard fight against colonialism make its voice heard? Well, it all starts with a plan, a really clear and principled blueprint. So let's dive into the foundational principles that have guided India's foreign policy for decades. All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the core blueprint India created. Then we'll get into its most famous idea, non-alignment. We'll also cover its powerful stand against injustice, break down the 5 principles of Panchsheel, see how India put these ideas into action, and finally wrap up by thinking about how these old principles are holding up against today's challenges. Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is 1947. The world is basically splitting into 2 very hostile teams, the US-led bloc and the Soviet-led bloc. For India, fresh out of colonial rule, the challenge was huge. How do you protect the independence you fought so hard for and focus on your own massive problems without getting sucked into these superpower fights? This is exactly why the blueprint was so critical. Right from the get-go, India had 3 main goals that have, amazingly, stayed pretty much the same over the years. First and foremost, protect the nation's borders and its sovereignty. That was non-negotiable. Second, kickstart economic development to pull millions of people out of poverty. And third, and this is key, maintain an independent foreign policy. This meant India could make its own calls on global issues without anyone pulling the strings. These 3 pillars have been the bedrock of its foreign policy ever since. This quote from Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister and really the main architect of its foreign policy, just hits the nail on the head. It gets right to the heart of it all. See, India's own painful experience with British colonialism created this deep, fundamental opposition to any kind of domination or discrimination anywhere in the world. This wasn't just a policy, it was a deeply held moral belief. All right, let's talk about maybe the most famous, most defining principle of India's early foreign policy. It's a concept that really allowed it to create a unique space for itself and for a lot of other newly independent countries. We're talking about non-alignment. So what exactly is non-alignment? Well, to put it simply, it was a refusal to pick a side. During the Cold War, you were pretty much expected to be either with Team USA or Team Soviet Union. India looked at that and chose a third option, a path of independence. It decided to look at every global issue based on its own merits, not because it was tied to some big alliance. And this slide really shows you the 2 camps. You had the US, forming military alliances like SEATO and CENTO to try and contain communism, and then you had the Soviet Union with its Warsaw Pact. When countries right in India's neighborhood, like Pakistan, joined these alliances, India saw it as the Cold War basically showing up on its front porch. It called them entangling alliances that would just drag it into conflicts that weren't its own. So you might be wondering, why choose this path? Well, the thinking behind it was actually very clear and strategic. Nehru and other leaders believed that joining a military bloc basically meant you were taking orders from a bigger, more powerful country, and it meant getting pulled into wars that had nothing to do with India's own interests. The country's time, money, and energy had to be focused on its own huge internal challenges: poverty, hunger, you name it. Non-alignment was really the shield that let India focus on itself. Now, coming directly from India's own history were 2 more principles that were absolutely non-negotiable. And these weren't just abstract ideas. They were a real reflection of the nation's experience and its long fight for dignity. You see, India never saw its own freedom struggle as just a one-off event. It saw it as part of a huge, global movement of people demanding their rights. So it just made sense that a core part of its foreign policy would be to actively help other nations in Asia and Africa that were still trying to break free from colonial rule. It was about paying it forward, really. And this wasn't just talk, by the way. India used big international platforms, especially the non-aligned movement, to really push the cause of independence for countries all over the world, from Indonesia to Algeria. It was also instrumental in the decolonization of Namibia and, much closer to home, the liberation of Bangladesh. This was policy in action. The other side of this coin was a really fierce opposition to racism in all its forms. India was one of the very first and loudest voices to condemn the horrible apartheid system in South Africa. It brought the issue up at the United Nations again and again, trying to rally the world to put pressure on the government there to end its racist policies. The bottom line was, the fight for justice had to be global. This commitment to peace and justice naturally leads to another foundational doctrine: If non-alignment was about how India dealt with the superpowers, Panchashil was the framework for how to live peacefully with all countries, especially its neighbors. The term is Panchashil, and it literally means the 5 principles. Now, for anyone studying for exams, this is a big one. Pay attention to the date. These principles were first officially laid out in an agreement between India and China on April 29, 1954. The 2 leaders involved were Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai and, of course, Prime Minister Nehru. So what are these 5 principles? They're basically a masterclass in diplomacy. First, mutual respect for each other's territory and sovereignty. Pretty much, you respect my borders, I'll respect yours. Second, mutual non-aggression, a promise not to attack each other. Third, mutual non-interference in internal affairs. You don't meddle in my politics, I won't meddle in yours. Fourth, equality and mutual benefit, making sure any deals we make are fair to both of us. And finally, the goal of it all, peaceful coexistence. Together, these became the bedrock of India's approach to international relations. Okay, so with these principles as its guide, how did India actually engage with the really big global issues? Let's take a look at its approach to 2 huge areas: nuclear weapons and its commitment to the United Nations. Now, India's position on disarmament is fascinating. On one hand, it has always argued for a world completely free of nuclear weapons. But on the other, it has always refused to sign big treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT. Why? Well, the core argument from India's side is that these treaties are fundamentally unfair. They create a world of nuclear haves and have-nots, basically a system where a few countries get to keep their nukes forever, while everyone else is forbidden from developing them. And this brings us to a really crucial point. After India conducted its own nuclear tests back in 1998, it immediately announced a no first-use policy. This is a public pledge to never be the one to use nuclear weapons first in a conflict. It's a doctrine of restraint, and it's how India positions itself as a responsible nuclear power. You can really see India's commitment to working with the global community through its role in the United Nations. From the very beginning, India has been a huge supporter. It's been one of the largest contributors of troops to UN peacekeeping missions, sending its soldiers to conflict zones all over the world, from Korea in the 50s to Somalia in the 90s. This long, consistent history of helping maintain global peace is a huge part of its argument for why it deserves a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. So, we've walked through the core principles that were laid down in those first few decades after independence. But the big question is, how do they hold up in the world today? Let's do a quick summary of the pillars and then look to the future. All right, to quickly recap, this is your study guide slide. The key pillars are the strategic freedom of non-alignment, the moral clarity of anti-colonialism and anti-racism, the diplomatic guide of Panchashil, a principled stand on disarmament, a deep faith in the UN, and, of course, nurturing ties with the Commonwealth, and, more recently, taking a leading role in the global fight against terrorism. And that leaves us with one final, really critical question. The old Cold War world, with its 2 clear sides, is long gone. We now live in a multipolar world, with a bunch of different power centers and totally new challenges. So how does India take this original blueprint of non-alignment, of Panchashil, and adapt it to navigate the messy, complicated realities of the 21st century? That right there is the central challenge for Indian foreign policy today.